because it takes human effort on both sides of the formula that keeps them in balance. When I first started talking about this topic years ago, in fact it's 1994 when the book came out, I gave an example of how purchasing power has maintained itself over long periods of time by saying that if we had lived in Rome, ancient Rome, and we had a 1 ounce gold coin, let's say it was that, and we could go to a clothier and we could get a nice toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. That was the cost in those days. Today, thousands of years later, if we had a 1 ounce gold coin, a kudura, or a libertata, we could go to a clothier, buy a very nice suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. And that was true in 1994. Today, you can actually get 2 suits. Is this bad? Actually, I think that that's going to level out again because right now there, I think, is a psychological surge for gold. It's catching up in a sense of some years of being ignored. But it'll all level out, and I have no doubt that in 20 years from now, that purchasing power, the gold, will be just the same as a suit of clothes, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. It does fluctuate, but when it fluctuates, it's usually to the advantage of the holder of the gold, never to the disadvantage of the holder of the gold. And so it does maintain extreme price stability over long periods of time, which is the one thing that the banks and the politicians absolutely detest. They do not want price stability of purchasing power. And so the fiat money predators hate it with a passion, and they will devise all kinds of sophisticated arguments to convince you and me that, as this gentleman said earlier, you know, gold is antiquated, it's not useful anymore, that was the old agrarian society, but this is the modern age, and so forth. All of these sophisticated arguments. But when you drill down and look at the fundamentals, you find that gold today is just as good as it ever has been as a backing for money. Now, why do these fiat money predators hate it? The answer was given to us in 1966, I think it is in a way that it cannot be improved upon, by a person that you might be surprised to hear it from. And that is our old friend, Alan Greenspan. Believe it or not, in 1966, Alan Greenspan was a young college professor, and he was what you might call an Ayn Rander. He was a great advocate of the philosophies of Ayn Rand, and he had written for the Ayn Rand Institute. And one of his papers that was published in that year, Alan Greenspan answers this question of why the politicians and the bankers hate gold. Here's what he said. The law of supply and demand is not to be conned. As the supply of money or claims increases relative to the supply of tangible assets in the economy, prices must eventually rise. Thus, the earnings saved by the productive members of society lose value in terms of goods. When the economy's books are finally balanced, one finds that this loss in value represents the goods purchased by the government for welfare of other purposes. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have to make its holding illegal, as was done with the case of gold by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. The financial policy of the welfare state requires that there be no way for owners of wealth to protect themselves. This is the shabby secret against the welfare statists' tirades against gold. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the hidden confiscation of wealth. Gold stands in the way of the insidious process. It stands as a protector of human rights. Wow. You can't say it any better than that. So what happened to Greenspan? He was taken to the top of the mountain. You know, shortly after he wrote this, he was hired by one of the J.P. Morgan companies, and then he was finally brought into the political side, moved up to the Federal Reserve System. In other words, he was taken to the mountain, and he was told, all of this can be yours. And he said, I'll take it. That's what happens to people. Did money change him, or was he always like that? That's back to the opening question. I don't know. Does he still believe it? The answer is yes. Ron Paul ran into Alan Greenspan about a year, or maybe 2 years ago, in one of the corridors of the hearing rooms, hearing buildings, the office buildings in Washington, D.C. And he describes it that he was walking down the hall, and here comes Greenspan, and they're right face to face. I'd like to have been there for that. The two titans, right? Ron Paul said, he asked Greenspan, he said, Mr. Greenspan, do you still believe what you wrote in that essay that was published in 1966 about gold? And he said that Greenspan kind of blinked a couple of times, and he looked right at him and said, yes, I do. However, in these modern times, it's impractical. Impractical for whom? For him, and for the Federal Reserve, and for the banking system, and the politicians, but not for the American people. Anyway, that's what Greenspan said, and I'm here to tell you I agree with it wholeheartedly. Now, some people say that there is not enough gold in the world to back the money system. And as I said a moment ago, the scarcity of gold is one of its strongest assets, one of its strongest characteristics. And what they don't realize is that any amount of gold will do. Even if the supply of gold were limited, and if we have every ounce of it out of the ground that could possibly be retrieved, and the supply were limited, it could still serve very well as a backing for gold. It just would mean that each unit would become more and more valuable with the passage of time. Not too shabby an arrangement. Where's the problem here? I don't get the problem. If I were a young man and I were to save an ounce of gold that, let's say today is worth $1,100, and I were to get to 20 or 30 years down the line and I find out that it's worth $3,000 or $5,000, where's the problem? It would be a great stimulus to savings, would it not? It would encourage people not to go into debt because you can make more money just hanging on to it than by borrowing and paying interest. It would encourage expansion. It would encourage private funding of ventures, get people out of debt. I don't see the problem there. But the real problem with this argument is that in reality the gold supply has not been exhausted, even close to it. I'm here to tell you that most of the gold on this planet is still in the ground and in the oceans. A few years ago, when the price of gold finally got up to about $500, I decided that it was time to look around for some gold mines. Maybe there's some values to be had in gold mines. Maybe I could invest a little bit in the gold mine. And I found one. The little mine had been boarded up for 20 years in Montana and Virginia City, and they were looking for capital to renovate the mine and go back into business. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. So I went to this little town of Virginia City. This is Montana, not Nevada. And, hung out in the coffee shop, talking to the people there, the locals, and say, what's going on in this town? Oh man, they're opening up all the mines. Well, if there's gold and silver out here, oh, lots of gold and silver around these hills, They hardly even scratched the surface there, but they went out of business when the price of gold was artificially suppressed, and it was no longer profitable to mine it. But that doesn't mean there was no gold in those mountains. It's just, there's more gold in the ground than they've ever dug out. And then when you look at the oceans, there must be 100 times more gold in the salt water of the oceans than there is in the ground. It's just that it's not, so far, it's never been economically feasible to extract it. But I can tell you when the price of gold gets to $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000, it will be economically feasible to extract it. And there's an unlimited supply of gold out there. So this argument, there's not enough gold, it's just sort of a childish argument. They don't understand the forces of supply and demand. Once the